Is this a joke? The voice of senior drill instructor Gunther ripped through the humid Carolina morning like shrapnel. It was not speech. It was a serrated blade of sound, sharpened by years of cutting down recruits until only raw nerves remained. His words carried across the asphalt with the practiced cruelty of a man who had built his career on breaking others. A ripple moved through the formation, a nervous tremor beneath the surface. Boots scraped. Breaths quickened. A few chuckles slipped out, quiet, complicit, the kind of laughter soldiers used when they knew someone else had just been chosen as the sacrifice of the day. And all eyes shifted toward her. Specialist Anna Sharma. She stood at the end of the line, still, almost unnaturally so. Her uniform was crisp but unremarkable, her frame smaller than most of the others, her face unreadable, smooth as stone. Not a flinch, not even the blink of discomfort when Gunther's voice lashed at her. She simply fixed her gaze on the horizon, as though the storm of humiliation at her feet was little more than an insect's hum in the distance. That silence was an answer, one louder than words. Gunther hated it. The air smelled of sweat, asphalt, and pine resin, a southern morning heavy with the threat of rain. Behind the formation, leaning against a Humvee in the shade of a longleaf pine, Colonel Evans watched. His eyes weren't on Gunther. They weren't on the trainees snickering into their chests. They were fixed on her hands. Hands loose at her sides, not clenched into fists like the others, not restless, not fidgeting with straps or pockets, just calm, too calm. Then he saw her stance, not flat-footed like rookies who hadn't yet learned balance. Her weight rested subtly forward on the balls of her feet as if every muscle were coiled but not strained. It was predatory readiness hidden beneath placid stillness, and Evans's brow furrowed. He had seen that posture before, not in textbooks, not in classrooms, in other places, places that didn't exist on official records, places where only ghosts walked. Gunther didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't understand. To him, silence was weakness. Stillness was surrender. His world was noise, energy, the brutal pounding of willpower into submission. Anna Sharma was a problem because she refused to respond, refused to break in the language he spoke. He sneered. Since you're clearly more suited for administrative duties, specialist, you'll catalog every piece of spent brass from this company after today's range. Count it, clean it, log it, by 0500 with a toothbrush. The venom in the word librarian hung in the air, poisonous and cheap. Yes, drill instructor, she said. Her voice was even. Low, not a trace of sarcasm or anger, not even resentment, just acknowledgement. That was worse. Gunther's jaw flexed. He wanted a crack in the armor, a grimace, a twitch, anything that said she was human and could be crushed like all the rest. Instead, she gave him nothing. And so the campaign began. In the days that followed, humiliation became routine. While her classmates practiced squad tactics, Anna was ordered to repaint the lines of the parking lot with a brush the size of a thumb. While they studied weapons systems, she was sent to inventory every salt and pepper shaker in the mess hall. He assigned her to meaningless, menial tasks, not to test her skill, but to isolate her, to mark her as different, to brand her as a lesson. This is what happens when you don't fit the mold. The other trainees noticed. Fear turned them into accomplices. They shunned her. In the chow hall, her tray sat alone at the corner table. In the barracks, her bunk was an island, untouched, avoided like the bed of someone already marked for failure. Whispers spread not of her strength but of her weakness, or at least the weakness Gunther told them to see. But what Gunther didn't understand was that humiliation in silence has a way of becoming its opposite. Every task he gave her, she executed with chilling precision. The brass casings were returned not just cleaned, but polished until they gleamed like mirrors, each logged with meticulous accuracy on a perfectly formatted sheet. The parking lot lines were so sharp they looked etched into the asphalt by machine. The salt and pepper inventory. She cross-referenced it against supply logs, flagging a discrepancy even the sergeant in charge had overlooked. She wasn't just completing tasks. She was mastering them, turning punishment into demonstration. And Gunther hated it, because the more she absorbed, the more his fury echoed back at him as hollow noise. The silence was growing louder. It wasn't just defiance. It was something else. Something none of the other trainees understood, and perhaps something Gunther feared to name. By the second week, the isolation was total. At night, the barracks hummed with whispered jokes and nervous laughter about her size, about her quietness, about how the drill instructor had made her his favorite target. And still, Anna said nothing. She simply cleaned her gear, checked her boots, folded her uniform with geometric precision. But alone, in the faint glow of the barracks light, her thoughts weren't immune. She felt it, the weight of eyes on her back, the subtle sting of rejection from people who hadn't even tried to know her, the loneliness of eating in silence while laughter echoed nearby. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when she let her eyes close, and for a flicker of time she asked herself the question no soldier dares admit. Was it worth it? Then she opened them again, the calm mask sliding back into place. Yes. Because what no one knew, what not even Gunther could imagine, was that she wasn't there for their approval. She wasn't there for the course, not in the way they thought. Her mission was different. Her reasons were her own, and her silence was the shield around a truth she carried like a hidden blade. Still the torment mounted, and the crucible loomed. Every soldier at Bragg knew of the ordeal called the Serpent's Tooth, 72 hours of forced marches, brutal navigation, and a live-fire ambush simulation designed to break spirits. It was whispered about in the barracks like a campfire ghost story. Some made it. Many didn't. The ones who failed rarely spoke of it again. Gunther was waiting for it. He was counting on it. The storm of humiliation he had built around Anna would end there. She would stumble. She would collapse. And in her failure, his world would be set right again. But in the quiet, in the calm, she carried something no storm could touch. Something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Why did the storm have to break now? The sky had been heavy all morning, a purple bruise on the horizon, but when the trainees shouldered their packs for the Serpent's Tooth, the air split open with wind. It was as if the mountain itself wanted to test them. The air smelled metallic, charged like the air before a lightning strike. Gunther stood in front of the formation, jaw locked tight, eyes like stone. His voice carried above the gusts, loud, certain, hungry for someone to fail. Today the mountain will test you, the rain will test you, the enemy will test you, but most of all you will test yourselves. There is no room for dead weight. Every link is part of the chain. One breaks, all fail. Don't be the weak link. His gaze lingered where everyone expected it would, on her. Anna didn't blink. The order came, teams moved out. She was assigned to Alpha, rear security. It was the position nobody wanted, the lonely eyes in the back, the one who saw what came too late. She adjusted her pack, balanced the weight high and tight, and started moving. Her gait was steady, almost casual. She wasn't wasting energy. She wasn't dragging herself forward like some already were. She flowed. But her silence didn't just hold the rear. It saw everything. The tilt of branches bending under wind, the birds that weren't singing anymore, the way the soil grew darker beneath the trees. The environment was a language, and she was reading it. Up front, Sergeant Davis wasn't reading anything. Young, eager, already loud enough to cover his unease. He barked orders at his team, pointed at a compass that spun uselessly in the electrically charged air. Their GPS unit failed within the first hour, water shorting its circuits. The backup compass gave false bearings. Alpha stumbled in circles, pushing through mud and brush, falling behind. "Pick it up," Davis's voice cracked. His frustration fed the panic spreading across faces streaked with rain and dirt. Boots slipped in the muck. A private cursed, another fell, the chain fraying. Gunther watched from the command tent, arms crossed. On his screen, Alpha's progress barely moved. Their signal dot crawled in circles. "I knew it," he muttered, almost with satisfaction. Bogged down, it's her. She's the dead weight. But in the ravine where rain turned dry soil to rivers, the real dead weight was about to fall. Alpha stumbled into a gully they didn't expect, a dry creek bed, now a torrent. Mud sucked at their boots, pulled them down. They clawed up the far bank, but halfway the ground erupted in fire and smoke. A training charge. A simulated IED. The blast knocked Sergeant Davis back, his voice cut off in a scream swallowed by thunder. By exercise rules, he was out. A casualty. Dead weight. The others froze. A wall of fear slammed into them. Who leads when the leader is down? Who moves first when the rain drowns out thought? For a moment they looked at each other with wild eyes. Then they looked at her. Anna was already moving. She knelt beside Davis, hands calm, deliberate, not panicked, not rushed. She checked him as if the wounds were real. Her pack hit the ground, webbing pulled free. Fingers moved in a blur, tying knots the others had never seen, a harness rigged in seconds. Efficient. Secure. Point, she said, looking at one soldier. Her voice was quiet, clear, solid enough to hold them steady. You help me move him. No shouting, no barking, just command without effort. And they obeyed. The rain thickened, sheets of water turning the world to a blur. The ridge above them cracked open with fire, pop-up targets, enemy silhouettes in the storm. The stress shoot had begun. Worst possible moment, worst possible ground. The two soldiers fired back, frantic, their shots high and wild, rifles rattling in shaking hands. Panic again. Gunther leaned closer to the monitors, waiting for collapse. But on another screen, her screen, the story was different. Anna unslung her rifle in one fluid motion. No wasted movement. She braced against a tree, body angled, perfectly stable in the chaos. Rain streaked down her lenses, but her eye didn't waver. Pop. 200 meters. A target folded in the storm. Pop. 250, concealed behind foliage, dropped. Pop, pop. Two more, quick, precise. As if wind, rain, and distance were already solved in her head before her finger touched the trigger. She moved with the casualty. Firing, moving, firing again. Calm rhythm, no break. Her rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of something deeper, something so practiced it seemed impossible. In the command tent, the comms officer stared. Sir, Alpha's targets are down, all of them. He blinked at the numbers. System shows every shot center mass. Category 4 storm, moving with a casualty. That's, sir, that's not possible. Gunther's satisfaction drained into something colder. His mouth went dry. His eyes locked on her feed. On the screen, rain blurred the world, but at its center was her specialist Sharma, calm, unmoving, a wisp of smoke curling from her rifle in the downpour. And when the last target dropped, silence fell in the ravine. Only the storm remained. Alpha stood stunned, breathing hard, covered in mud, but alive because of her. She lowered her rifle, face unreadable, and bent back to check the drag harness on Davis. No celebration, no acknowledgement, just work. Back in the tent, Gunther's world tilted. His prediction of failure had been rewritten in real time, replaced by numbers no trainee should produce. Numbers few soldiers ever could. He felt it in his gut, not admiration. Not yet. Something closer to dread. Colonel Evans walked into the room then, drawn by the chaos of voices, the impossible data scrolling across screens. His eyes went to her footage immediately. He didn't speak. He just watched her hands, the reloads, the fluid mechanics of muscle memory far beyond the level of a course trainee. Evans said one thing, quiet, sharp enough to cut the noise. "Get me her file." The room froze. "Sir, her file's right here," the captain stammered, motioning to the trainee packet. Evans didn't even look at him. "Not that one, the real one, vault access, alpha clearance." His tone was final. The room turned to stone. The order echoed. Gunther's throat tightened. He didn't understand, but deep down a sickness spread in his gut. because for the first time, he wasn't sure who he'd been shouting at all this time. And what she hadn't told them was about to come out. What was she doing here? That was the question burning in the silence of the command tent. On the screen, Anna Sharma's helmet cam replayed in slow motion. Every shot, every movement, every impossible decision under the storm's weight. It was more than precision. It was instinct. The kind of instinct that only comes from years no one could account for. Gunther stood stiff, jaw tight, eyes flicking from the screen to the colonel, to the floor, to the screen again. His certainty was gone. All the words he'd built his authority on, weakness, failure, dead weight, hung now like ashes in the air. Colonel Evans didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on her movements, studying, remembering. He leaned closer, watched the way her rifle tilted just slightly to account for sight over bore, the way she indexed the magazine without ever glancing at it, the way her finger reset perfectly after recoil. None of this belonged to a trainee, not even to most seasoned soldiers. It belonged to someone else entirely. "Captain," Evans said quietly. The room leaned in, straining to catch his tone. "Get me her primary record, vault access, my clearance." The young officer hesitated, blinking. "Sir, this is her file, Specialist Anna Sharma, packets right." Not the trainee file. Evans didn't raise his voice, but it cut sharper than a shout. "The real one." Silence deepened. The captain swallowed, nodded, and disappeared out the door, boots echoing down the hall. Every eye in the room followed him, then slid back to Evans. But the colonel gave them nothing. His focus never left the screen, the quiet storm of her skill frozen in replay. Gunther felt sweat bead under his collar, his fists clenched behind his back. Something inside him whispered what he didn't want to believe. He had been blind. He had mocked something he didn't understand. Minutes dragged. The storm outside hammered the tent canvas. Thunder rolled. Inside, the weight was worse. The captain returned, face pale. In his hands, a thin manila folder sealed with red tape. Across the front, the words screamed in black ink, "Top secret /NOFORN/eyes only." He handed it to Evans with shaking fingers. The colonel broke the seal. Paper rustled loud in the suffocating quiet. He read slowly. His eyes moved down the page. Each line seemed to carve his expression deeper into stone. Then he closed the folder, rested his hand on it, and finally turned. His gaze swept the room. Officers, technicians, and finally Gunther, rigid but trembling inside. "For the education of everyone here," Evans said, his voice calm, low, but charged with iron. "Let's clarify who Specialist Sharma really is." A breath held, a room braced. He lifted the paper. "Name Anya Sharma." His eyes flicked toward Gunther. "Actual rank, Master Sergeant." The words detonated. Gunther froze. His throat tightened until breathing itself felt like defiance. Master Sergeant. The title echoed in his head like a death toll. That rank towered above his own. That rank meant decades of service, authority, leadership. Respect he had denied her spat on. Evans continued, voice steady. "She is wearing the rank of Specialist as part of a deep cover assignment. Unit. United States Army Special Operations Command. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta." The name hit like a strike to the chest. A name spoken only in rumors, in hushed corners, never in daylight. Delta Force. Ghost soldiers, the tip of the spear. Gasps rippled, soft but undeniable. Even the technicians at their consoles froze, hands hovering above keys. Gunther felt the blood drain from his face. His world tilted. The woman he had called librarian was Delta. Evans went on. "Service record includes Operation Nomad Soul, Operation Silent Talon, Operation Winter Cipher. Over 80 credited direct action missions in hostile territory, the details of which are, of course, classified." He let that hang. Qualifications: Master Parachutist, Halo and HAHO certified, senior instructor at Special Forces Advanced Urban Combat Course, recipient of the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, Purple Heart. The colonel lowered the page. His eyes swept the room again. She was sent here under cover, not to train, not to compete, to observe, to assess the effectiveness of this program. The Storm and Alpha team's failure forced her hand. Otherwise, you would never have seen what she is capable of. The folder shut with a soft thud. The tent was so quiet the rain itself seemed muted. The door opened, and there she was. Still in wet, mud-stained gear, helmet tucked under her arm, boots caked. She stepped inside, quiet as always, no announcement, no pretense. But something shifted. Her posture straightened, subtle but absolute. The mask of the trainee slid away, replaced by something undeniable. Master Sergeant stood where Specialist had been. Colonel Evans turned to face her. He didn't smile, he didn't greet. He drew himself tall, shoulders squaring, and snapped into a perfect salute, razor sharp. "Master Sergeant Sharma," he said, voice thick with something close to reverence. "My apologies for the unprofessional reception you received here. It will be corrected." The tent held its breath. She returned the salute, equal precision, equal silence. "No apology necessary, Colonel," she said, calm as rain. "Observation complete." Gunther felt his stomach twist to ice. His body betrayed him, stiff as if pinned to the earth. Everything he thought he knew about control, about breaking spirits, about building soldiers, had just been inverted in a single moment. And when she lowered her hand, the hierarchy of the entire base shifted forever. How do legends begin? Not with banners, not with fanfare, but with whispers. The day after the storm, Fort Bragg felt different. The air itself seemed charged, as if the thunder hadn't left but settled in the walls. Trainees in the chow hall leaned close over trays of eggs and coffee, voices hushed. Mechanics in the motor pool swapped fragments while wiping grease from their hands. Privates cleaning rifles in silence stole glances at one another, as though daring someone else to say it first. They all had the same story, the story of the quiet specialist. Some told of her impossible marksmanship in the storm, targets erased one after another, as if the wind itself obeyed her. Others swore she had moved through the ravine like she'd trained there her whole life, as if mud and rain and chaos were nothing, but terrain she'd already mapped in her mind. And each retelling added weight. Not noise, not exaggeration, weight. The story carried like a pressure wave, silent and unstoppable, reshaping the air. They called her the Ghost, because nobody had seen her coming. Gunther heard the whispers too. They followed him everywhere now. Not openly, no one dared, but he could feel them, in the barracks, on the range, in the way trainees looked at him differently, less fear, more doubt, as if they knew his thunder had been silenced by something greater. The revelation of her rank haunted him. Master Sergeant, Delta, titles that mocked his arrogance. He replayed every insult in his mind, every order he barked, every humiliation he designed. Each memory struck like a lash turned back on himself. He should have broken her. Instead, she had broken the very foundation of his methods. But she didn't gloat, didn't even acknowledge it. The morning after the reveal, Gunther found her in the armory. She was alone, cleaning her rifle. Not a recruit now, not even pretending. She insisted on doing the work herself, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, each motion steady and deliberate. He stood there for a long time, stiff, the words caught in his throat. Pride clashed with shame until neither could find ground. Finally, he spoke. Not loud, not in command, quiet. Master Sergeant. The title dragged across his tongue like a foreign language. She looked up. Her hands didn't stop moving. "The wind sheer yesterday," he said, his voice stripped of its old venom. "You compensated for crosswinds no manual accounts for, 20 miles per hour plus vertical updraft in the ravine. You made shots the training doctrine calls impossible." He swallowed. "The manual is wrong." It was not an apology, but it was worse in a way. It was humility, a concession. I need to teach my men what is possible, not just what the book says. Will you show me how you made the calculation? The room was silent except for the slow rhythm of her cleaning cloth against steel. She studied him, not unkindly, not triumphantly, just measured. Of course, drill instructor, she said softly. Get a notepad. It's about reading the wind, not just feeling it. Watch the rain, the leaves, the flag. The environment tells you everything. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. Something inside him shifted, not broken, reforged. From that day, Gunther changed. The shouting didn't vanish, the army would never be silent, but it softened, tempered. He began to punctuate his fury with patience. He brought his trainees to the range on windy days and didn't let them fire a shot until they had watched the world around them. He taught them to listen, to notice, to see. He even gave it a name, the Sharma standard. It wasn't about volume anymore. It wasn't about breaking a spirit until it screamed. It was about teaching them to hold steady when the storm was loudest, to be the calm at the center, to see what others missed. Trainees noticed. The program began to change. And Anna Sharma, still officially a specialist on paper, became something else entirely. A phantom mentor. She never taught a class, never gave a lecture, but her presence was instruction enough. In the gym, she would pause by a trainee struggling with form, adjust their posture with a few words, then walk away. On the land navigation course, she would point out a faint contour line others had missed, then vanish back into the trees. On the firing line, she would stand behind a private, silent, until he steadied his breath and tightened his grouping. They learned not just from her skill, but from her silence. And the myth grew. The ravine where Alpha Team had nearly failed, where she had turned collapse into victory, acquired a new name among the trainees. Sharma's Ledge. It became a pilgrimage. At the end of the Serpent's Tooth, each new class left a small stone cairn there, a tribute to the quiet professional who had rewritten the course itself. Gunther, once her tormentor, now told her story himself, not as folklore but as warning and wisdom. He stood in front of fresh recruits, voice lower now, steadier, and told them about the day he underestimated the quiet one. I judged her by what I saw, he said, and I was a fool. The most dangerous person on the battlefield is the one you underestimate, the one who listens more than they speak. The recruits listened in silence, not because he shouted, because the story demanded it. And Anna, she said nothing. She faded into her role, unseen and uncelebrated. She had no need for their awe, no need for recognition. Her work was observation. Her legacy was transformation. In time, she would vanish as quietly as she had arrived. No farewell, no plaque, no ceremony, just an empty bunk where she had once slept. But long before she disappeared back into the shadows, her impact had already seeped into the roots of the program. It would live on in the way soldiers paused to listen to the wind before they fired, in the way instructors valued silence over noise, in the way humility began to mean more than swagger. Gunther had wanted to destroy her. Instead, she had rebuilt him. And that, perhaps more than her rank, more than her medals, more than the myth itself, was the quiet power of who she really was. Not thunder, not noise, but silence that could not be broken. When did she leave? No one could answer. There was no ceremony, no farewell, no duffel bag slung over her shoulder in the morning light. One day, the bunk at the far end of the barracks was simply empty, the sheets stripped, the gear gone, a quiet void where she had been. For a time, some thought she had been reassigned in the night. Others whispered she had never really been there at all, that maybe she was always a ghost, planted in their memories by the storm itself. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the absence. Because absence has a weight all its own. Trainees found themselves looking for her in small ways. On the firing line, they caught themselves glancing to the rear, half expecting to see her standing there, calm, silent, waiting for them to breathe correctly before pulling the trigger. In the chow hall, they glanced at the corner table where she had always eaten alone, now empty but somehow still occupied by memory. It was inescapable. She wasn't there, but she was everywhere. Gunther felt it most. His voice carried differently now, not just because it was softer, though it was, not just because he shouted less, though he did. It carried because it had been humbled, because when he barked, recruits no longer heard only authority. They heard the echo of the story behind it. They heard the silence that had undone him. He began every new cycle the same way. He would stand before the fresh formation of wide-eyed recruits, shoulders squared, voice steady, and tell them the story. Not as myth, not as campfire legend, as confession. He told them about the quiet woman in the corner of the line, the one he mocked, humiliated, broke down with chores and scorn. He told them how he thought she would fail, how he wanted her to fail, and how, in the storm, she had done the impossible. He did not spare himself. "I judged her by her cover," he said, each word deliberate, the weight of regret still there. "And I was wrong, I assumed, I underestimated, and I was a fool. Learn from my failure, not just her strength." Then he would lower his voice to a near whisper, and they leaned in, every single one. The most dangerous person on the battlefield is the one you don't see coming. The quiet professional, the calm in the chaos. Remember that. It became a ritual. Every class heard it. Every trainee carried it. And over time, her name became a kind of anchor. On the Serpent's Tooth course, they all stopped at the ravine where she had stood against the storm. They called it Sharma's Ledge. They built a cairn there, stone by stone. Each graduating team placed their own rock on the pile, a gesture of respect, a silent salute. No plaque was ever hung. No order ever required it, but the pile grew, year after year, into something undeniable. The myth spread further still. In the gyms, soldiers swapped stories about the librarian who had been Delta. On long ruck marches, they spoke of her shots in the rain, her silence under fire. Some details blurred into exaggeration. They said she could strip a rifle blindfolded in 30 seconds, that she could predict a storm by the way the birds moved, that her file was written in invisible ink. None of it mattered. What mattered was the reverence. And the quiet shift in what the base began to value. Trainees started listening more, watching more. They learned to pay attention not just to orders shouted at them, but to details whispered by the world around them. A change in wind direction, a silence in the trees, a faint contour on a map others missed. They began to prize calmness under stress more than volume in the barracks. They began to respect the quiet ones. Anna's legacy was not carved in stone. It was not written in the manuals. It lived in the shift of culture, the redefinition of excellence. And Gunther, the man who had once tried to crush her spirit, became its unlikely steward. He still shouted, the army would always shout, but the roar was tempered now, balanced with something else. Patience, reflection, instruction born from humility. He pushed his soldiers harder than ever, but when they broke, he built them back differently, quieter, sharper, more precise. The man who once believed power lived in volume, now taught them that power lived in silence. And though Anna Sharma had vanished, her ghost walked with every class that passed through those gates. Sometimes at night, recruits swore they saw her, a shadow moving through the trees on the navigation course, a figure in the gym correcting a grip, then disappearing when they turned, an extra presence on the firing line, unseen but felt in the stillness before a shot. But whether she was real or just memory didn't matter, because what she had left behind was real enough. Her absence had become her lesson. That true strength doesn't demand to be seen. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't crave acknowledgement. It simply exists and changes everything around it. At Fort Bragg, they stopped asking where she went. They started asking something else. What would she do? And in that question, her legend lived. How far can a whisper travel? Further than anyone at Fort Bragg expected. Months passed, classes graduated, new recruits arrived. None of them ever met her, but all of them knew her. Her name passed from platoon to platoon like contraband, a secret traded in the dark. She was here last cycle, someone would say. They called her a librarian until the storm. They say she shot through rain at 200 meters and never missed. They say she was Delta. And even when doubt crept in, even when someone smirked and said it was just another barracks story, the silence that followed was always the same. A silence that meant maybe it wasn't a story at all. The myth grew legs. It left Bragg. Soldiers transferring out carried it to other posts. It surfaced in late-night conversations overseas, on dusty outposts where men and women clung to stories that reminded them competence still mattered more than swagger. They began to call her something new, not just the ghost, not just the quiet specialist. They called her the standard. It was the highest praise one soldier could give another. He's sharp, quiet, calm like Sharma. And the name carried weight because it wasn't attached to medals or headlines. It was attached to something rarer: respect. Back at Bragg, Gunther had changed in ways few recognized at first. His voice still carried across the asphalt parade ground. His fury still echoed in the barracks, but his eyes were different. He noticed things now. A private at the back of formation, silent but steady, Gunther no longer ignored him. He watched. He remembered. He tested. Not with humiliation, not with scorn, but with expectation. He had stopped looking for the loudest. He was searching for the quiet ones, the observers, the thinkers, the ones who listened more than they spoke. And the trainees noticed too. On windy days, Gunther brought them to the range. Not to fire, to watch, to sit in silence as flags snapped in the gusts, as dust swirled in eddies, as the grass leaned under invisible fingers of air. Don't just see it, he said. Hear it, feel it, read it. At first they thought it was another punishment, another one of Gunther's games, but then slowly they began to see what he meant. The wind wasn't chaos, it was a map, and when they fired, their shots steadied. When they asked why the change, Gunther never gave details. He never said her name aloud to them, but he always said the same thing. The manual isn't the limit. The manual is just paper. Reality is out there. Learn to listen to it. It was his way of passing her lesson forward, without claiming it as his own. And somewhere deep inside he knew his authority was no longer his. It had been reshaped by her. He didn't resent it, not anymore. Because he had been arrogant, and she had taught him the lesson no manual could. Quietly, the myth of the ghost of Bragg spread into ritual. Every serpent's tooth ended at Sharma's ledge. Every cairn grew larger. Some stones had names scratched into them. Others bore only silence. But every one was a testimony. Whispers turned to reverence. Reverence turned to tradition. And tradition turned to something larger. In after-action reviews, officers referenced the Sharma standard. In lessons on marksmanship, instructors reminded students that the wind was not an enemy but a teacher. In leadership briefings, the story of the underestimated specialist became cautionary parable, judged by skill, not appearance. Even those who doubted her existence still carried the lesson, because the myth didn't need proof. The myth had power. Somewhere far away, Anna Sharma herself was gone again, disappeared into the shadows of operations no one spoke of. She wore no recognition from Bragg, no certificate, no farewell. She likely never mentioned it again. But her silence was louder than any speech could have been. Because silence had rebuilt a man like Gunther. Silence had reshaped a course. Silence had redefined what excellence meant for a generation of soldiers. And silence, whispered forward, was remaking an army. Not by force, not by thunder. By the quiet that cannot be broken. How does a man live with being wrong? Gunther asked himself that question every morning now. The mirror gave him no answer. The same face stared back, square jaw, scarred skin, eyes etched by years of training recruits in fire and fury. But something in the eyes had shifted. They no longer held the certainty of a man who believed volume was strength. They carried something heavier, a kind of humility that could only come from being undone. He didn't run from it, not anymore. He carried it because it wasn't weakness, it was the lesson. He had been broken once, not by yelling, not by punishment, but by silence. A silence that stood taller than his noise, and now it lived in him. The trainees noticed before he did. He still shouted. Of course he shouted. The army still demanded thunder, but after the roar came something new. A pause, a question, a steady voice that explained instead of just demanding. "Why did you miss that shot?" he would ask, voice quieter, eyes locked on the recruit. "What was the wind telling you?" They would stammer, unsure how to answer, and he would wait, patient, demanding thought, not just obedience. It wasn't the old Gunther. It was something else, something he never could have become on his own. The legend of Sharma had turned him into a student again. He started keeping a notebook, nothing official, just pages filled with sketches of wind patterns, diagrams of shooting angles, notes about silence, about observation. At night in his office, he wrote the same words at the top of each page, Sharma standard. It wasn't hero worship, it was accountability. Because every time he raised his voice, every time arrogance threatened to creep back in, he remembered the woman he had underestimated. He remembered the storm, the impossible shots, the salute from the colonel, and the way she had looked at him in the armory, not with triumph but with patience. She had given him a chance to change, and he refused to waste it. The change rippled outward. Recruits began to sense that something was different about training under Gunther. He wasn't just breaking them anymore. He was shaping them, pushing them harder, yes, but also teaching them to think, to read, to listen. They began calling it Gunther's second phase. Some said he'd been humbled by a ghost. Others weren't sure what had changed. He never told them the whole truth, but he always told the story. Not every detail, not the classified parts, just enough. "There was a soldier once," he said to every new class. "Quiet, overlooked. I thought she'd break. Instead, she held steady when the storm hit. She taught me that silence is sometimes the loudest strength you'll ever see." He didn't tell them her real name anymore. He didn't need to. The myth had grown larger than the woman. The myth belonged to all of them. And it traveled. On deployment, soldiers carried the story with them into the desert, the jungle, the mountains. It was passed like a prayer, like a charm against arrogance. "Remember the ghost," they said before missions. "Remember the quiet professional." Somewhere Anna Sharma herself would have dismissed it. She would have said legends don't matter, only the work, only the standard. But legends have their own gravity. They fill the spaces where silence leaves room. And Gunther had become its unlikely guardian. He never sought redemption. He didn't ask for it. But it found him anyway in the respect of his trainees, in the way they carried his words forward. At night, walking past the cairn at Sharma's ledge, he sometimes stopped. He never left a stone. He didn't feel worthy. Instead, he would stand there in the dark, listening to the wind, hearing her voice in the silence. "Look at the way the rain falls, the way the leaves turn. The environment tells you everything. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." And he did. The man who once believed noise was strength had become the quiet observer, the mentor who never claimed credit for the lesson that wasn't his. The myth of Anna Sharma grew, but the change in Gunther was the proof it mattered. Because sometimes the loudest man in the room has to be broken before he can finally hear. And he had heard her. How long does a ghost last? Longer than a storm, longer than a file stamped classified, longer than the memory of those who once knew her face. At Fort Bragg the years turned. New recruits arrived, old ones left. The cycle of training rolled on, relentless as the seasons, but through it all there was one constant: the story. The cairn at Sharma's ledge grew higher with every class, stones piled by hands that had never seen her, some smooth, some jagged, some with names carved into them, most left bare, a monument not of stone but of silence. Drill instructors came and went, commanders rotated, missions rose and faded, but the ghost of the quiet professional walked with every soldier who carried her lesson forward. It wasn't in a manual, it wasn't on a medal. It was in the way a recruit steadied their breath before pulling a trigger, in the way a team leader paused in a storm, eyes closed, listening to the wind instead of cursing it, in the way soldiers began to notice the quiet ones among them, not dismissing them but watching, respecting, waiting. The culture had shifted, and at its heart was the woman who had asked for nothing. Anna Sharma never returned to Bragg. She disappeared back into shadows where ghosts belong, her name buried in files few would ever read, her deeds blurred into secrecy. There were no parades, no plaques, no speeches, just silence. But silence was enough, because silence had left its mark. Gunther, once her tormentor, was now her most unlikely disciple. Years later, when recruits whispered his name, it was no longer with fear alone. It was with respect. He had changed. They all knew it. And though he never said it outright, though he never carved it into the cairn, everyone understood why. He carried her lesson like a scar, and he taught differently because of it. He never spoke of her medals. He never bragged about her missions. He didn't even use her name. He only told the story, the storm, the impossible shots, the silence that held steady when the world collapsed. And in every telling, the moral was clear. Do not underestimate. Do not assume. The quietest soldier in your ranks may be the one who saves you all. The myth spread far beyond Bragg, into deserts and mountains, into whispered stories around campfires overseas. They called her the ghost, the standard, the quiet professional. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story was this: no one really knew where the truth ended and the legend began. Maybe she could strip a rifle blindfolded in 30 seconds. Maybe she could taste the air and predict a storm. Maybe her file was written in invisible ink. It didn't matter, because the core of the story was real, and that was enough to shape generations. Anna Sharma's true legacy wasn't in her record. It wasn't in classified folders or commendations locked in vaults. It was in the quiet recalibration of what mattered. That strength was not loud. That authority was not forced. That dignity did not shout. It simply acted. Years later, when Gunther himself finally retired, he left behind no statues, no speeches either. Just a generation of soldiers trained under his second phase, soldiers who carried with them the lesson he himself had been humbled to learn. That sometimes the loudest voice in the room means the least. That true professionals are often the quietest ones. That the greatest authority is not taken, it is earned, demonstrated, proven in silence. And somewhere far away, perhaps in another operation buried under code names and red tape, Anna Sharma still walked, still worked, still observed, still silent. But whether she lived or died, whether her mission succeeded or failed, didn't matter to Bragg anymore, because her legacy was already permanent. It was in the cairn. It was in the story. It was in the quiet professionals who rose from the ranks because someone once had dared to stand still under fire and let silence speak louder than noise. The world is full of arrogance, of shouting, of those who mistake volume for strength. But sometimes, the calmest presence in the storm is the one that changes everything. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.